Hi everyone, welcome to Yoga with Heini. I'm Heini, and in this week's video I'm going to show you how to use yoga blocks in your practice. In some cases, how to get deeper into poses with the help of blocks, and sometimes how to do a pose in a safer, more effective way. Let's get started. I have a couple of previous videos about using props overall in the practice. So I have a discussion video about if props are beneficial or not, and you can check it here. And I have also a video about using household items as props. If you don't have yoga-specific props at home, how you can just use everyday items in your practice as props. And you can check that here as well. But now let's get started with today's video. And we have 4 sections in the video: how to use props in standing poses, then on all fours, then seated, and finally lying down poses. Let's start with the standing poses first. There are many different ways to use blocks in standing poses. I'll show you some examples, and you might have different ways using them yourself. But we'll start with a very basic one. So Tadasana pose, our basic standing pose. And in this pose, you could use block between your legs. So using the block as a way to kind of intensify how you use your legs, how you use your inner thighs. So just gently squeezing a block between the legs. It could be between the thighs or knees. Very good way to get your leg muscles, especially your inner thighs, all fired up. And now that we have block between the legs, you could use block in the same way for chair pose. I'll turn sideways, so I still have the block between the legs as I come into chair pose. The same idea, intensifying how you use your inner thighs. So slowly coming into chair pose all the time, gently squeezing the block between the legs. And it might be that you need to adjust the feet slightly closer together or wider apart, depending on your block, but also depending on the width of your pelvis. And you might need to also turn the block sideways when you come into chair pose. Well, we continue from chair pose into a full forward bend. There are a couple of ways to use block for a full forward bend, but one is definitely using it between the legs. And still the same idea, coming into forward bend, gently squeezing the block between the legs really helps to activate the legs. And especially if you have injuries around the hamstrings, for example, having a block there between the legs when you do a full forward bend can really help to also kind of safeguard the injured area. So very helpful there as well. So you could even do a full sequence, like a small sequence, using that block between the legs. Now in standing pose, we could also use block under the hands. It doesn't need to be always between the legs. There are many poses where you can use it under the hands. And one of them would be that kind of full forward bend. So you could do, again, full forward bend, legs closer together or wider apart, but having a block somewhere in front of you as you come into your forward bend. Maybe you come first into flat back, and as you come lower down, you could pick that block to have it supporting your hands, because that helps you to support your back and even your legs, because you have something here, not all support coming just through the legs, but you have something under the hands. So a very handy prop there. And if you are lucky to have 2 blocks, then you could have 1 block for each hand. So you could do the same in a wide-legged forward bend. Maybe we're lucky to have 2 blocks, and they could be higher, they could be lower, but again, they could be there waiting for you as you come into your full forward bend, this time legs wider apart. So now we have 1 block under each hand. And same here, it's a really nice support for the back, but also for the legs. So if you feel that these forward bends are really intense, either for your legs or your back, then I suggest having something like the blocks under your hands. Very helpful tool. So it's not just about getting deeper, it's about keeping the poses safer as well. And sometimes, in order to get deeper into a pose, we need to first make sure that the body feels safe. So using blocks, it's not just for complete beginners who can't get deep enough into the pose. It's also for very seasoned, advanced yogis to sometimes get deeper, but also learn how to activate muscles more in poses. And that might be one way of getting, in a way, deeper into the pose, not just deeper physically, so not just closer to the floor, but also deeper in the way that you are using your muscles more. Enough talking here. Let's continue into our next standing pose. So all these kind of triangle shaped poses, so triangles, side angle poses. Here, often a block under one hand is really, really useful, whether you're a beginner or a very advanced yogi. So coming into triangle pose, you can come from the floor, you can come from higher up, but having something to elevate the hand off the floor could be really helpful. So you have your other arm free to reach up, you might bring it behind the back, but the hand that's closer to the floor, to have it on top of something. Maybe because there's very intense stretch and you don't want to bring your hand down onto the floor. But as well, if you are really flexi-bendy, it might be that going all the way down onto the floor takes you, in a way, too deep, takes you so far into the pose that it's difficult to activate. You've gone beyond the point where you can keep your muscles active. So then lifting a bit higher up, and I'm talking from personal experience, lifting a bit higher up actually might take you to a place where you can keep your legs active, you can keep your core, your side more active, and the pose becomes more beneficial. It's not just about getting your hand and your head as close to the floor as possible. So here, in a triangle pose, let's continue into the wide side angle pose. So that's just kind of knee bending more, and you can, in a same way, use the block here under the hand. And the block could be either on the inside of that front leg, or it could be on the outside. I suggest trying both versions. It depends a bit on the person where they like to have their block. From here, we could continue. I'll bring that other arm down. We could continue into quite challenging balancing pose, the half moon balancing pose. And here, a block underhand can be really useful. So walk that back foot a bit closer and step the front hand and the block forward, and then we can support ourselves onto that block, and start to lift the back leg up. And again here, you often see people bringing hand all the way down onto the floor, and that's very, very fine. But having that block underhand just might give you a bit more edge to lift that hand maybe off the floor as well. And then you can kind of test to lift hand off the block as well. So actually might make you balance more than just leaning hand onto the floor. Good, I think that's all our standing poses. Let's move on to all fours next. Okay, let's come on to all fours. And here, when we come onto all fours, if you have two blocks or boxes, that might be even better than one block. But there are definitely ways we can use just one block as well. But we'll start from hands and knees. And now, if you have two blocks, you can bring one block under each hand, and it might be sideways or they might be flat on the floor. It depends on the kind of blocks you have, their size, kind of their width, quite a lot. But just on all fours, maybe doing some cat-cow movements, it can be really quite nice to elevate the hands slightly off the floor. It feels like you have more space for your back, your shoulders to move. Or maybe you have injuries, in hands or wrists and you don't want to be on hands, then lowering down onto elbows can be a really nice way to adapt the all fours pose. And you could do this by bringing elbows onto the floor, 100%. But sometimes elevating just slightly off the floor, when you start to move, again, it gives a bit more of that space to move. So, highly recommended trying elbows on top of blocks. Another way would be, again, if you have injuries in hands, wrists, you don't want to do downward facing dog on your hands, is to have blocks under elbows and then come into a sort of dolphin pose, but with the blocks under elbows. Again, it might give you a bit more room for the neck, for the head, versus if you have your elbows, forearms all the way down onto the mat. And of course, you can do downward dog on hands, but on blocks as well. And especially some people who have injuries in wrists, the blocks might allow you to have a bit of a different kind of angle and grip in the hands and in the wrists. So you could spread your hands this way, or you might turn your block sideways, which allows a different kind of grip in the blocks and different kind of angle in your wrists. So for a downward dog, blocks might be really nice. And of course, we could even do a full-on vinyasa flow with blocks under hands. So you might go all the way into plank, lower down to low plank. Again, there's nice extra space under the chest here, coming into big upward facing dog, and then back into downward dog, all done with blocks under the hands. A really nice adaptation. And you might do child's pose with blocks. So again, you might have one, you might have two blocks. So you could use it to give an extra opening around the shoulders, leave hands on top of blocks, and then lean down onto the mat. Or maybe you have one block and you want some support for your head in child's pose. Bring a block under the head. It might allow your neck to relax more. Or for people who have maybe injuries, issues in the knees, in the hips, bringing a block under pelvis in child's pose can really help to make the pose a bit more comfortable, a bit more accessible. We don't want any pose to hurt, so using blocks there can also make the pose a bit more comfortable. And next, let's move into seated poses. There are many, many different ways you can use the blocks here. I'll show you a few quite common ways to use blocks in seated poses. And maybe the most common is to use a block under pelvis when you are in a seated pose. So it could be a cross-legged seat, it could be legs in front of you, but what the block does, it allows often the pelvis and the lower back to find a bit more neutral place, a bit more neutral alignment that might make the pose easier on the hips and the back. So especially if you find yourself in a cross-legged seat with knees really high up and you're kind of hunching back and you start to feel a lot of tension in your hips, then I suggest trying a block under the pelvis. Maybe even getting knees below the hip joints might make this seat much more comfortable. And then if we go into seated forward bends, here, same thing. If you find yourself almost leaning back when you're trying to go forward, then sitting on an edge of a block just often helps the pelvis to come to slightly forward, starting from that neutral place, and it often makes then leaning forward easier. So leaning into a forward bend, it might help, especially in the beginning, to have something under the pelvis. And this applies also to other seated poses. So you might be maybe in a butterfly pose. You could sit there and it might help you to lean the pelvis forward. Now, of course, again, if there is maybe already a lot of mobility and you feel like the legs are going too open, for example, in a butterfly pose, then actually bringing the blocks under the knees to give some support so legs don't just flop out might be more beneficial. So you could also bring blocks under knees as you go into your forward bends. And same thing with legs straight in front of you. You can bring blocks under the knees to keep them a bit bent. And having blocks here under the knees can also help you maybe keep the legs a bit more active. So you can imagine you're pressing knees against the blocks and then leaning forward might help you to actually activate the front of the legs more than just keeping them flat on the mat. So you're very, very, very highly recommended, again, trying blocks under knees as well. And it could be any seated pose. Now, another way to use blocks in a seated pose would be under hands. And this is especially useful when we do a seated twist. So if you ever feel that your arms are just too short when the teacher says, and now bring hand onto the floor when you're doing seated poses, then bring blocks under hands, because it's a lot about proportions. Some of us have shorter arms, very long back, and some people have the other way around. So then if a teacher tells you to bring hand flat onto the ground, but the arm is just a bit too short, then use blocks under hands. So I'll first show this in a twist. So we're doing a seated twist. Let's have one leg straight, one leg bent. So your other arm is hugging the knee, the opposite knee, and then you bring one arm behind the back. So for example, I can't bring my hand onto the mat. My arm is just a bit too short here. So then bringing a block under the hand just helps me to create that slight support, helps me to also lift the back up a bit when I can support onto the arm. If you have been practicing jump throughs, maybe you're doing more Ashtanga yoga, maybe you're practicing jump throughs, and same thing there, you're supposed to have your hands on the floor so that you can move your legs back and forth. But if the arms are just a bit too short, then bring blocks under hands, and this creates more space to move the legs, to lift the pelvis up. Or maybe it's just a staff pose and you want to lift up. So this way you can press more onto your hands, onto your arms. So those are some of quite beneficial ways of using blocks in seated poses. And then let's go into our final section, using blocks in lying down poses. There are many ways to use blocks lying down as well. I'll show you a few ways. And one quite obvious, quite common, is to use a block under pelvis when we do bridge pose, so like a supported bridge pose. So coming up into bridge pose and then bringing a block under the pelvis. This can make bridge pose a bit lighter, a bit easier. Might give you more time to focus on activation in the legs when you don't need to try to hover the pelvis up. It can also be quite relaxing pose. You might completely relax your pelvis on top of the block as well. But just like with standing poses, here as well, you could use a block between the legs to enhance that work in your inner legs, in the inner thighs, and that might help with full core activation. So again, squeezing a block between the legs and then lifting up into a bridge can really highlight how much the legs are working in a bridge pose. Then again, a bit more relaxed pose, coming into a reclining twist. So here, if you feel that the legs are kind of hovering off the ground, bring a block under the legs. And this way the legs can relax, they can be supported, and you're not forcing your legs onto the ground. If you tend to get a bit of pain, discomfort in the hips or lower back in a twist, another way would be to try having a block between the legs. So for some people, that helps as well. So definitely blocks can be helpful in twists. I'll show the twist the other way, and one more way to use a block would be under your shoulder. So bringing legs to the other side. So now I'm going to support this right shoulder and arm. If you often feel that the shoulder comes uncomfortably off the floor, then bring a block under the shoulder. And that can equally make the pose more comfortable and safer. And lying down, we have our, my favorite pose maybe, Shavasana pose. And here, you could use blocks under legs. A bit like a bolster, you can also use blocks under legs just to keep the knees a bit bent and keep the knees slightly elevated off the floor. It can make the pose more comfortable for hips, lower back. You could also use blocks on top of hands in Shavasana pose. So this might be really quite calming and relaxing way of using blocks in Shavasana pose, especially if you have heavier blocks, then kind of grounding your hands under blocks can be really calming. Or often I see people putting block under the head. So depending on curves in the back, in the neck, it might be really comfortable to support head onto a block to find that calm, resting pose. So many ways there again to use blocks in lying down poses. I hope you found these little tips and ideas useful. Here's another one, sitting on top of the shins but with a block under the pelvis. So I think there's almost endless ways of using blocks in your practice. Use your imagination, be creative when thinking about how could I use blocks, how could I use props to enhance my pose. Remember, they're not walking sticks, they're not just aids for beginners to get deeper into poses. They are enhancements for anyone who practices yoga. I would also love to hear about your ideas of using blocks in the practice. So please leave your comments below. Tell me how you like to use blocks in your practice. And if you enjoyed the video, as always, please give it a thumbs up and share it with anyone who you think might enjoy, might benefit from this video. I look forward to seeing you next week in our new video. Bye!